1942. Kersey, Colorado. That morning the wind cut sharp, carrying the bite of old regrets like broken glass in its howl. It tore through the cottonwoods lining the south field, shaking loose planks on forgotten sheds and kicking up clouds of pale yellow dust that worked deep into the folds of Liora Kane's worn coat. She moved slow along the rutted dirt road away from the depot, shoulders rounded against the cold, one battered suitcase swinging in her grip, the baby riding her hip. The other three trailed close, small hands clutching her skirts, silent as ghosts. She had run out of places to turn. The grain elevator man hadn't let her get 3 words out before he shook his head and looked away. Same story at the grocer's counter. Same at the little white church where the woman behind the door wouldn't meet her eyes. 4 miles, they all said, without saying it. Not in times like these. The town wasn't cruel. It was just bone-tired. Too many telegrams from the war. Too many dry summers. Too many hollow-eyed strangers drifting through with empty hands and hungrier mouths. Mercy had dried up long ago. Only the hard math of survival remained. Her boots ground against the gravel. She'd covered nearly 3 miles when the road bent away from town and opened into wide wheat fields rippling like silver under the wind's long strokes. The suitcase felt heavier with every stride. The baby fussed softly. Hunger gnawed at Leora's own stomach, a steady fire she refused to let show. She couldn't afford to. Nothing had passed her lips since yesterday's thin coffee. Just ahead, a low rise rose beyond a weed-choked ditch, grass standing tall and wild. She crossed it, set the suitcase down, eased the baby to the ground, then sank beside them. The children huddled close, faces pale, saying nothing. Their clothes still carried the faint stink of coal smoke and train iron. Liora pulled her knees up tight, rested her forehead against them, and shut her eyes. One thought hammered inside her head. You don't get to fall apart. Not here. Not now. She saw again the small house back in Kansas, the terrible quiet of the morning her husband walked out for good. No goodbye. Just an empty belt hook and tire tracks fading in the dust. Afterward came the rumors. A waitress in Topeka, a poker debt gone sour. Liora had stopped caring. The real wound was the silence he left behind, the waiting she now carried by herself. A diesel engine growled in the distance. She kept her head down. The truck slowed, then stopped. Boots crunched on the shoulder. A man's voice, rough but not harsh, called over the wind. "You all right there, ma'am?" She lifted her gaze but stayed quiet. Her mouth was dry as old leather. He came closer, big through the shoulders, hat low and dusted with the road, face weathered deep by years of sun and hard labor, like it had been chiseled instead of born. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Just saw the young ones and figured you might could use a lift." She gave one guarded nod. The children stared up at him, wide-eyed as fawns. "Got a ranch a piece west of here," he went on, tipping his head toward the truck. "Name's Gideon Shaw, heading back with supplies, if you need a warm place for the night." She rose slowly, lifted the baby first, then the suitcase. No words. She simply started toward the truck. He didn't reach to carry anything for her, just fell in step beside her, matching the weary rhythm of her walk. The children scrambled up first. She followed. The cab's heat rolled over her like a blanket, and her throat closed tight. She swallowed it back. Gideon slid behind the wheel, turned the key. The engine coughed once, then caught with a low rumble. They rolled on in silence for miles. Only when the road began to climb toward the distant foothills did he speak again. "What can you do?" The question wasn't sharp. not doubtful. Just plain curious, the way a man might ask about a tool he'd never handled before, wanting to know what still worked inside her, what hadn't shattered yet. She shot him a quick, sideways look. "I can cook," she said. "Clean house, mend whatever's ripped or worn. I read fine. I can figure numbers quick." She drew a breath. "I work hard and fast. I don't whine about it." A short pause. "And I can scoop up 4 kids at once and still swing an axe on firewood." Gideon gave a single, slow dip of his chin. "That'll do," he said, voice low and even. No more words passed between them the rest of the drive. When the ranch finally appeared, low, sturdy buildings pressed against the long white curve of snow-dusted mountains, it hit her like something half-remembered from a dream she'd buried years back. She wouldn't let hope take root. Not yet. But she studied the soft yellow glow spilling from the windows and heard the wind sigh through the barbed wire fences like a long-held breath finally released. She pulled the children closer against her side, as though this patch of hard earth might, just might, be a place where she could start piecing something together again. Even if all she rebuilt was herself. The bunkhouse was plain. 2 small rooms, windows patched with tape, an ancient cast-iron stove squatting in the corner. Still, it was dry and held heat better than anything they'd had in weeks. Gideon dropped a heavy key ring into her palm, pointed toward the back and said the pump was out there, then walked away without pressing for a single story. That first night she perched on the edge of the narrow cot, the baby breathing soft and steady against her chest. The others lay tangled together under a thick quilt that carried the faint scent of cedar shavings and old campfire smoke. She watched the gentle rise and fall of their narrow shoulders. The quiet in the room pressed close, but it wasn't bitter. Her hands shook, slow and private. Sleep stayed away. In the dark, her thoughts circled the hard months behind her. The empty finger where her wedding band used to sit. The shoes her oldest boy had outgrown months ago. The mornings she'd stood on church back steps begging for day-old bread and receiving only pinched smiles and quicker doors. She'd done what survival demanded, swallowed pride, traded scraps of dignity for a full belly, endured the sideways glances that cut deeper than words. Now here she was, in a stranger's bunkhouse with empty pockets, no kin nearby, and nothing guaranteed beyond dawn's chores. Yet for the first time in too long, she didn't lie awake fearing someone might slip in and steal her children while her eyes were closed. Come morning she rose before first light, moved without noise, gathered her hair with a scrap of twine, and stepped out into a world where frost glittered on every blade of grass like shattered glass. The air tasted of livestock, pine smoke, and the clean, cold snap of daybreak. She found Gideon in the barn, buried to the shoulders in burlap sacks of feed. "Where do I begin?" she asked. He didn't pause. "You know horses?" She hesitated. "Not really, a little, less. Then we start with the chickens," he said. He walked her through it. How to fork out the old bedding, how to hold the feed pail high so the hens didn't mob her legs. She paid close attention, eyes on his steady hands. He moved like the work was part of his breathing. No wasted motion, every step counted. He spoke only what needed saying, but there was no edge to it. When she fumbled, he simply stepped in, demonstrated once more, then stepped aside again. They labored side by side through most of the daylight. The children hovered near, filling a battered basket with eggs, murmuring secrets to the goats through the slats. Once her youngest boy, Bram, slipped in the muck and started to wail. Gideon crouched, peeled a carrot with his pocket knife, and handed it over. "Ain't no shame in getting dirty, son," he said. "World's got worse stains than mud." Liora couldn't recall the last time anyone had spoken to her kids as though they mattered. By the time the sun bled low, she ached in every bone, a deep, honest exhaustion she hadn't felt in years. She never expected supper, but Gideon brought it anyway. A heavy iron pot of stew loaded with potatoes and chunks of venison, steam still rising. He set it on the stoop beside half a loaf of bread and a single folded scrap of paper. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll mend fence by the orchard." That was all it said. She held the note a long minute before laying it beside the empty bowls. Later, after the children had drifted off, she slipped outside. The stars burned brighter than memory allowed, sharp and close. The wind had died completely. Only the distant lowing of cattle broke the stillness. She didn't weep. Not exactly. But the iron knot behind her ribs eased just enough to let a real breath slip through. From inside, one of the little ones sighed in sleep. She stepped back in, tugged the quilt higher over their shoulders, and sat by the stove until the last red coals faded to gray ash. Something had changed. Nothing dramatic, no thunderclap. But Liora felt the shift deep in her gut. A steady place to put her hands to work. A solid roof overhead. A man who hadn't recoiled from the weight she carried or snapped at her kids for daring to be hungry. Trust still felt too fragile. Too soon. Maybe it didn't have to be full trust yet. Maybe stringing one hard day to the next would carry them far enough. The fence line by the orchard sagged crooked across a gentle slope that seemed to want to shrug the whole thing loose. Years of hasty fixes, rusted wire twisted tight, mismatched planks nailed crooked, left it leaning like an old-timer too weary to stand straight. Liora stood there gripping a hammer, cheeks stung by the sharp morning wind. Gideon nodded toward a splintered post smack in the middle. "That one's the troublemaker. We don't shore it up. The cows will push through by supper and we'll spend a week rounding 'em back." He passed her a work glove with the index finger worn clean through. She tugged it on anyway. They fell into a quiet rhythm, the kind that didn't need words to feel easy. She braced the post while he swung the maul, driving it deep. When the wire bucked loose, she held it steady. When her hands slipped, he caught the strand without a word. Once she caught sight of a thick, pale scar curling along the base of his thumb. Old, faded, the kind that had its own story. She didn't pry. He didn't volunteer. Come noon, they dropped down under the gnarled apple tree that guarded the orchard's edge. Gideon pried open a tin of beans and handed it over first. She took it after only a heartbeat's pause. "My brother used to call these cowboy caviar," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not quite a smile. "You got a brother?" "Had one." He took the tin back. "Fell off a barn roof back in '81. Went quick, at least." She gave a small nod. No words fit right. But the plain way he said it, no tears, no drama, made her think maybe sorrow didn't always have to swallow you whole. Maybe sometimes it was just another load you shouldered, same as a fence post or a 50-pound sack of grain. He never once asked about her husband. Never would. Instead, he spoke of the land, how it came to him in ragged pieces after his father Calder passed, how the orchard used to burst with fruit before 3 brutal springs of frost killed the blossoms, how he'd come close to signing it away 5 different times, but couldn't pull the trigger. "Didn't know where else I'd belong," he said quietly. "Some things just root in your bones." She knew exactly what he meant. When the beans were gone, they stood and got back to it. Her arms burned. Blisters rose on her palms. She never let out a sound. That night in the bunkhouse, she found Jory, her oldest, sitting up under the lantern, a dog-eared book open across his knees. He was mouthing the words, finger tracing each line like it might disappear if he didn't hold it down. "Where'd that come from?" she asked softly. "Mr. Shaw gave it to me," he said. "Said there's a whole shelf inside the house. Said I could take more whenever." She knelt, turned the page with him. "Did you thank him?" He nodded quick. She pressed a kiss to the crown of his head. Next morning, Gideon appeared at the bunkhouse door with a coat draped over his arm. "Too small for me these days," he said with a shrug. "Thought it might fit you better." She took it. "Thank you." He scratched the back of his neck. "You've been solid help." That was it, just those few words. But they settled warm in her chest like the first good fire after a long, cold spell. The days started to settle into a rhythm. Up with the sun, hard work till noon, quiet supper shared at the long table. The children trailed Gideon like he was a tall, steady cottonwood they could shelter under. He taught them how to balance a feed bucket so it didn't spill, how to stroke a horse's muzzle gentle enough to ease its nerves. Liora watched it all, a strange, sweet ache rising in her throat. One evening after the youngest had drifted off, she lingered in the barn and helped Gideon latch the last stall. He hadn't asked her to stay. She just did. When the final hasp clicked shut and the tools were hung, she turned to leave, but hesitated. "Why'd you pull over for us that day on the road?" she asked. He took his time answering. "Saw your boy wave at the truck. Just a tiny lift of his hand. Reminded me of someone. That's all." She waited, hoping for more. He didn't give it, just touched the brim of his hat. "Sleep well." She watched him walk toward the house, tall, quiet, framed against the wide scatter of stars, and felt something inside her ease open. Not fireworks, not joy exactly, more like ice breaking up on a frozen creek, slow and certain. A life wasn't something you stumbled across ready-made. It was something you raised slowly, plank by plank, with raw palms and a heart still half afraid to believe. Liora turned back toward the bunkhouse, its door glowing soft from the lantern inside. For the first time in forever, she allowed herself the smallest sliver of hope. By spring, the valley had begun to wake. Snow pulled back up the ridges like a retreating tide, and green pushed through the fields the way life creeps back into a body that's been sleeping too long. The orchard trees still stood bare and bony, but now they held quiet promise, instead of just winter's weight. Her hands moved sure now. Calves had dropped late in February, and Liora had knelt in the straw for 3 of them, sleeves shoved high, calm and steady exactly the way Gideon had taught her. They had found a rhythm together, work and breath and daylight all falling into step. She was up before the sky lightened, brewing coffee strong enough to wake the dead, frying biscuits golden in the skillet while the youngest still dreamed. The bunkhouse had shed its old ghosts. No more smell of stale smoke and worn-out leather. Now it carried the clean scent of lye soap, fresh bread rising, and something alive. She had picked up reading again. Gideon offered her his shelf of worn paperbacks, mostly old Western yarns and dog-eared almanacs, but she took them gratefully, lips forming the words silently as she turned the pages. The children read too. They squabbled less, laughed more. Every so often Gideon slipped them small treasures, a battered harmonica, a pocket knife with a loose blade, a tin whistle that squealed when Bram puffed into it too hard. She thanked him each time, but the words always felt too small. He hadn't just given them shelter and meals. He'd handed them back the simple strength to stand upright. Town still hadn't warmed to her. In the feed store, certain women would spot her coming and cross to the other side of the street. Liora caught the glances, the whispers cupped behind palms. Took up with that rancher awful quick. Word is she chased off her husband. Those kids probably aren't even his. Heard she was living rough on the road. Gideon never asked what the talk was, but she knew he heard it. He just kept moving forward the same way he always had. Fence line, dirt road, hammer, quiet, steady. Yet the air between them had changed. One night she stepped onto the porch and found him seated on the top step, cigarette glowing in the dark. She paused behind him, uncertain. "They're saying I'm sleeping in your house," he said without turning, "saying the kids are calling you Daddy now." He stayed facing the night. "Are they?" "No," she answered softly. Then, after a beat, "But they might someday." He said nothing. She eased down beside him. Together they watched the stars drag thin silver threads across the black. He never reached for her. Not once. But sometimes she'd catch him looking, not hungry, not possessive, but careful, like he was studying something rare and easily cracked. "I don't want to break what you've built here," she said. His jaw flexed once, twice. "You haven't." He flicked the cigarette into the dirt, ground it under his boot heel. "I was out here alone, running this place, eating by myself, talking only when the work demanded it. Folks respected the work, but nobody really knew me. Nobody asked." He let the words hang. "You did." Silence stretched long between them. Only a distant nightbird's call cut the quiet. Then he rose. "Come on, kids'll start wondering." She followed him inside. The days had grown warmer. Work turned harder in a new way. Fence mending under a sun that stuck to your skin like damp wool. Calves wandering farther now, testing the boundaries. The pump gave out twice that month. Then word came from Topeka, carried in a plain envelope. A deputy from the next county over handed it to her personally, the block letters of her name scrawled sharp across the front. It was from Silas Crow. Not dead. Not missing. He wanted the children back. Claimed she'd walked out on him without reason. Said he'd built a new family now, a proper home. Insisted she had no right to keep them from him. Liora read it once, standing beneath the big cottonwood by the pump, the paper trembling slightly in the breeze. She folded it small, tight, and tucked it deep into her apron pocket. Gideon found her there, face drained of color, frozen still. "You holding up?" he asked low. She passed him the letter without a word. He read it through once, slow, then again. His expression barely shifted, but his knuckles whitened around the edges before going slack. "He telling the truth?" Gideon asked. She shook her head. "He walked out. No note, no money, nothing to eat. I waited till the snow thawed. Then I packed what little we had and put the kids on a train." Gideon stared at the ground a long while, boot scuffing dust. Finally, he said, "You'll need somebody standing with you." She didn't ask what he meant. She already felt it. They weren't just two lost souls sharing the same hard ground anymore. Something stronger had taken root. She sensed it in the way he moved a half step nearer, close enough for her to feel the warmth rolling off him, in the quiet certainty that crept into his voice. "I won't let him take them," he said. She hadn't known how badly she needed those words until they landed. She managed one nod. He didn't reach for her. Not yet. But right then, she would have let him. Merrick Vale arrived from Greeley in a truck polished too shiny for gravel roads. He stepped out in a crisp suit, face already set like he'd decided everything on the drive over. They gathered around Gideon's kitchen table. Liora wore her only decent blouse, hair pulled back severe, hands clasped so tight her knuckles went bloodless. Gideon sat beside her, solid and silent, one forearm planted on the scarred wood like he was ready to absorb whatever blow came next. Merrick spread a thick folder open, papers sliding across the tabletop. "Mr. Crow has filed for full custody," he said flat. Claims you abandoned the marriage without cause, that you're unfit, that the children belong to him. He left, Liora answered, voice steady as she could keep it. I waited 3 full months. Not a dime ever came. You got proof of that? Merrick asked. She shook her head once. The lawyer exhaled sharp through his nose. Then it's his word against yours. His gaze flicked to Gideon, sizing him up. Unless Mr. Shaw here can testify to the children's well-being on this ranch, or unless there's a legal tie between the two of you. Leora's stomach plunged. Gideon didn't so much as blink. Spell it out, he said. Merrick shrugged. If you were legally married, it would give her solid ground. A stable home. Judges set store by that. Silence dropped heavy. Outside, the wind swung around sudden, banging the screen door hard against the frame. Somewhere down the pasture, a cow let out a long, mournful bawl. Liora stared at the tabletop, heart hammering so loud she swore the others could hear it. She'd worn a ring once, spoken vows once, handed her whole self to a man who turned his back and walked away. She wasn't sure her heart could survive betting on those words again. She pushed back her chair. I need some air. Gideon stayed put. She stepped onto the porch, palms braced on the rough railing, eyes sweeping the wide spread of land. It was Gideon's land, his name on the deed, his house, his barn. His sweat soaked into every fence post and furrow. His barn. His calloused hands that had raised every beam, patched every break, hauled every load. But it was her kids' laughter ringing through the orchard branches, her biscuits steaming on the stove, her careful stitches holding the curtains straight. This land carried her mark now, too. Gideon stepped out after a while. He didn't speak at first, just took his place beside her at the rail. I'm not asking you, he said. She turned her face toward him. I'm not asking you to marry me because you're scared, he continued, voice low. Or because you feel you owe me. I'm not handing you a name like it's a patch for a hole. She stayed quiet. I've been watching you, he said softer. Seen you shoulder more than most folks could carry and still get up every morning. Seen you raise those 4 without letting anger eat you alive. I'd marry you today, tomorrow, or never at all. Just say it. But no matter how this plays out with that man, you're not walking into it by yourself. She looked at him. Really looked. Noticed the silver thread scattered through his beard, the deep sun-etched lines around his eyes, the fresh cut on his knuckle from yesterday's barbed wire. He wasn't riding in to save her. He was offering to stand shoulder to shoulder. There was a world of difference. She reached out and took his hand. Held it steady. Sure. You'd marry a woman with 4 kids, she said. A trail of hard years, and a heart that's been cracked open before? I'd be proud to, he answered. And for the first time since she'd climbed down from that train in the dust, Liora Kane let herself want something fierce and real. Not just another day to survive, not just 4 walls and a meal, a life with this man, rooted in this hard, beautiful ground. So they married. Simple and small, the children in their cleanest shirts and dresses. She wore a dress borrowed from a neighbor woman down the road. The town preacher spoke the words plain and unhurried. When he asked if they promised to stand by each other, Liora said, yes. Clear. No shake in her voice. Gideon looked at her like she was forged from iron and light at the same time. Something unbreakable. Something holy. When he kissed her, it felt like stepping across a long threshold into the place she'd always been meant to rest. Merrick Vale filed the new papers 2 days later. The next letter that came from Kansas arrived stamped and official. It was answered by one signed in her new name, Mrs. Liora Shaw. She didn't know yet what the judge would decide. But for the first time in years, she wasn't steeling herself for another fall. She had someone at her side who would stay there, no matter the storm. The hearing was scheduled for late June. They borrowed a neighbor's reliable truck, pressed their best clothes, and rode in quiet resolve. The children stayed back with Calix, the neighbor girl who helped with spring calving. Liora watched the golden wheat fields roll past the window, stretching towards the blue line of mountains. The sun beat down hot and high. Her palms stayed damp. Gideon drove easy, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting relaxed on his knee. Every few miles he'd glance her way. Not worried, just checking. A quiet reminder. I'm right here. They reached the courthouse an hour early and sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom doors. Silas Crow, her former husband, showed up 5 minutes before the gavel. He looked worn down by time. Face bloated, hair thinned to wisps. The suit he wore didn't fit right, shoulders pinched, tie knotted crooked, but that old smile hadn't changed. Smug. Empty. He didn't glance at the school photos of the children spread on the side table. Didn't ask how they were growing, if they were happy. Just dropped into his seat beside his lawyer and shot her a quick, knowing wink. She kept her eyes straight ahead. The judge was a woman, gray hair pulled into a severe bun, face set like stone, no trace of warmth. Both sides spoke. Documents changed hands. Stories were laid bare. Silas claimed Liora had walked out in pure spite, said she'd turned the kids against him, accused her of shacking up with a stranger and using the children as bargaining chips. Gideon took the stand next. His voice rolled out even and low, like a slow river over stones. He laid it out plain. How he'd first spotted Liora and the kids on that dusty roadside. What he'd witnessed since. How she'd poured herself into the ranch, hands in the dirt, sleeves rolled, never once backing down. How the children had come alive under her watch. Color returning to their cheeks, laughter breaking the quiet. How she was up before dawn every day, reading them stories by lantern light each night, showing his empty house what real warmth looked like again. She didn't show up here shattered, he said. She showed up fighting, and she's still fighting. That kind of fire, you don't run across it twice in a lifetime. When Leora's turn came, her voice trembled at the start, thin as a first frost. But she steadied quick and spoke the plain truth. She told the court how she'd waited in that empty Kansas house, how she'd boiled salt water and a few scraps to feed hungry mouths when the pantry ran bare. How she'd walked from one hard-luck town to the next until somebody finally asked what she could give instead of what she'd lost. She admitted she wasn't perfect. I'm no saint, she said, but I'm a mother, and I never stopped being one, not even on the worst days. When the last words hung in the air, Judge Rowan said she'd take it under advisement. Gideon and Liora drove home, with the windows rolled down. By the time the ranch silhouette appeared against the pink-streaked sky, the evening breeze was soft and warm. Liora let the wind whip her hair loose and didn't bother reaching for a scarf. Gideon eased the truck into the drive and cut the engine. They sat quiet for a beat. Then he stretched across the seat and covered her hand with his rough palm. You did real good in there, he said. She met his eyes. I'm not sure it'll change anything. It changed something for me, he answered. She didn't cry. Not quite. But her chest swelled tight and full, a feeling she'd locked away so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. Custody denied. Full guardianship granted to Liora Shaw, with the court naming Gideon co-guardian through marriage and shared home. She read it twice, standing barefoot in the open doorway, coffee and dry summer earth thick in the air. She passed it to Gideon without speaking. He scanned it once, folded it neat, slipped it into his hip pocket. Then he pulled her close. No words, just the two of them holding on in the slant of morning sun, while one of the kids hollered from inside for breakfast. The days after felt lighter, even if the routine stayed the same. She still rose with first light, still packed tin lunches, still scrubbed mud from little boots and picked weevils from the bean jar. But now she smiled easier, laughed sooner. Gideon built a simple shelf for her growing stack of books. He carved her name into the wood, small, tucked in the corner so you had to look close to see it. She put in a row of sunflowers along the porch edge. The children started calling him Pa without anyone prompting them. Talk turned to next summer, to Christmas, to someday. Liora, who once walked with her eyes on the ground and her jaw set hard, now lifted her face to the sun more often. Let the light find her. Let herself be noticed. Let herself belong. Come fall the orchard gave again. Not a big harvest, just a handful of small, knobby apples clinging stubborn to bent limbs. Liora picked every one she could reach, filled a basket, and simmered them down with a shake of cinnamon and the last scraped sugar from the bottom of the old tin. Gideon came in late from the barn that night. The smell of apple pie hit him at the door. He stopped in the threshold, hat in hand, watching her move around the kitchen like he'd never seen anything finer. "Smells like a reason to keep breathing," he said. She glanced up from the counter, a small smile tugging. Could be. They ate together, kids crowded elbow to elbow, scrapping over the crispy edges and begging seconds. Afterward, Liora sat on the porch with her knitting needles clicking, while Gideon fiddled with the old radio in the window, pulling in a faint war dispatch from London, static-laced and distant. The world out there kept churning with its troubles, but the ranch held firm. That night, after the children were tucked into their bunks and the house settled into deep quiet, Gideon came to her slow, asking for nothing, offering everything. They didn't repeat the vows. They didn't need to. They didn't need to repeat the words. The way Gideon's hands moved over her carried a promise stronger than any recited vow. He saw all of her. Not only the gentle places, but the jagged scars, the silent sorrow she still carried, the way a sudden slam could make her shoulders hitch even now. And she saw him clear, too. The long years of solitude he'd worn like old leather, the steady routines he'd built to keep the emptiness at bay, never dreaming there could be more. They met right there in the raw middle ground. No pretending, no scorekeeping, just two souls who'd weathered too many hard seasons and still found the courage to reach for something better. Afterward, she rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow rise and fall of his breathing, the faint tick of the wall clock marking time in the dark. "I've been thinking," he murmured, voice rough and quiet, "about adding another room to the bunkhouse." She shifted against him. "Why?" "For your sewing things, and maybe a bigger bed." He paused. "These kids are shooting up fast. Won't be long before they're crowding us out." She smiled into the fabric of his shirt. "They're already halfway grown." He ran his fingers through her hair, slow and gentle. "Then we'd better start hammering." Winter rolled in quick and mean. Snow piled deep over the fence lines. Wind screamed through every crack in the shutters. But this year, the place was ready. Wood stacked chest-high against the wall. Pantry shelves bowed under jars and sacks. Patched coats hung in a neat row beside boots passed down from bigger feet. Liora had never tasted this kind of quiet before. Not the empty hush of hardship, but a deep, earned fullness. A peace built from calluses and care. The lean months didn't scare her anymore. She faced them square, apron pockets stuffed with lists, a smudge of flour always on her cheek like a badge. One morning she stood at the sink, suds up to her elbows, washing plates and little paws. She paused, pressed a palm low against her belly. Something stirred, small, quick, alive. New. She kept it to herself at first. Let it settle. Let it grow. Weeks slipped by, her dresses pulled tighter across the middle. Fatigue hit harder, faster. Gideon noticed. Of course he did. But he waited. One night she went to him, took his rough hand, and guided it to the spot where the movement was strongest. His face cracked open. Just a little, but enough to show the man behind the quiet. "I didn't think," he started, then stopped. "Me neither," she whispered. He wrapped her close, holding her like he understood every layer of what she carried. Not just the new life, but the old fears, the fragile hope, the wonder of daring to begin again. Later he carved a tiny pair of wooden boots, exact match to the ones he wore every day, and hung them above the mantel. "Just in case it's a boy," he said, "and if it's a girl, well, she can wear 'em anyway." Come spring, the town threw its first barn dance in years. Gideon wasn't keen. "Too many eyes," he muttered, but Liora met his gaze. "Let them look." So they went. She wore her best blue dress, the gentle swell of her belly just beginning to show. He put on a fresh shirt and the boots he hadn't cleaned since his father Calder passed. They danced only once, but once was plenty. As the fiddles slowed, someone pressed a cold drink into their hands. Another asked about the baby. Soon they were at a back table, laughing, the deep, easy laughter that only comes after you've walked through fire and found green on the other side. Gideon looked at her across the table, eyes soft in the lantern glow. "You sure you're happy?" he asked. She nodded slow. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, but I do." The sun dropped behind the ridges as they drove home, the truck bed full of sleepy children. The baby kicked inside her, turning like she already knew the road led straight to home. The baby arrived on a warm August morning, light, golden, and thick, the valley humming with grasshoppers. Liora had been rolling dough when the first sharp pain gripped her. She braced hard against the table, breathing deep and even, refusing to cry out. She sent Jory running for Gideon. He came at a dead sprint from the barn, hands still slick with axle grease from a slipped pulley. He took one look at her pale, steady face and gave a single nod. No words, just scooped her up gentle, carried her to the bedroom, and hollered for Alowan, the midwife down the road. The labor stretched long, but never turned cruel. Liora met every wave the way she'd met every hard thing. Teeth set, silent grit, and a quiet fire burning deeper than muscle. When the baby finally came, she didn't wail right away, just opened wide, calm eyes, and stared up at Liora like she'd stepped straight from somewhere sacred and saw no reason to fuss. A girl. Gideon cradled her like someone had handed him a lantern in pitch black. "She's got your eyes," he whispered. "No," Liora said, her smile faint but real. "She's got her own." They named her Thora. When the other children filed in, they crowded close, tiny fingers brushing her hands, whispering secrets only siblings share. Liora sank back against the pillows, half dozing, and felt a quiet settle inside her she hadn't known was missing. Not just relief, not safety, pure, bone-deep peace. By winter, Thora was cooing and clutching fistfuls of Gideon's shirt, with a grip that surprised them both. The older ones doted on her. Even Jory, now taller than Leora's shoulder, went soft around the edges whenever she was near. Gideon built a crib by hand, carving delicate flowers along the rails. He never explained it, but Liora understood. His mother's garden had vanished years ago. Some memories he carried in silence, shaping them into wood instead of words. The town eased, too, inch by inch. Folks who once stared right through her now lifted a hand from their wagon seats in greeting. The woman at the feed store slipped her leftover bolts of cloth for mending. A neighbor stopped by to ask if her boys might help with branding come spring. No one dug into her old story anymore. They saw what counted. The family she'd pieced together, the land she worked side by side with Gideon, the children who now met eyes without flinching. That year she set a row of sunflowers along the fence. Gideon gave her a sidelong look. "Ain't much good for anything," he said. "They make me smile," she answered. "That's plenty." He left them standing. The years slipped by like that. The orchard flowered fuller each spring. The children grew tall and straight-backed, gentle at the heart. The bunkhouse turned first into her sewing corner, then a schoolroom, then a spare place for visitors when old acquaintances drifted through. One summer, Liora climbed to the loft and found her old suitcase tucked away, still packed with clothes too small now, and papers that held no weight anymore. She sat with it open a long minute, then closed the lid for good. She didn't need to keep looking back. She knew who she was. Liora Shaw, mother, wife, baker of bread and builder of calm, raiser of boys who honored women, and a girl who never jumped at thunder. The woman no town would hire. The woman one man had trusted enough to ask one plain question. "What can you do?" She'd answered, honest, no shame in her voice. And together they'd raised something solid enough to cradle real love. One evening after the day's work was done and the porch boards had cooled, Gideon sat beside her, eyes on the sky bleeding violet. "Ever think about pulling up stakes?" he asked, gaze still forward. "Sometimes," she said, "but never for real." "Why not?" She considered it, then tipped her chin toward the field where the wind ran through the grass like a long, slow exhale. "Because I never knew the world could feel this way, like it might actually let me stay." He reached for her hand. His palm was smooth from years of labor, still strong, but kinder now. "You ain't going anywhere," he said. She smiled. The children's voices carried across the yard, the youngest, no longer a baby, laughing as she chased her brothers through the dusk. The sunflowers bowed toward the fading light. A window somewhere glowed soft and steady. Behind them stood a home raised slow and true. A life pieced together from rough years, now holding firm. Liora rested her head against Gideon's shoulder. They watched the last of the day slip away. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso Legal Barra Disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.